Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of The Financial Confessions. I am your host, Chelsea Fagan, founder and CEO of The Financial Diet and person who loves to talk about money. And I'm very excited today because I have a guest who loves talking about money. I think I'm going to say almost as much as I do, although possibly exactly as much as I do. It's hard to say. We'll find out. But he is someone that I've been following on Twitter for a very long time and is probably one of the remaining reasons why I enjoy being on that website, which is objectively a net negative for everyone who participates in it. It's not a good website. But he's doing some good stuff over there, specifically around the topics of things like wage transparency, salary transparency, freelancing, all of these topics that are obviously very important to us at TFD, both in the media journalism industries where he happens to work and just kind of work more broadly. A lot of the lessons in terms of advocating for yourself and others when it comes to fair pay or advocating for yourself as a freelancer applies across the spectrum, but it's frankly a topic that doesn't get talked about enough. And it especially, I think, doesn't get talked about enough by people who have already achieved these very prestigious posts within an industry. He happens to kind of be at the intersection of both. He is the Smarter Living editor at the New York Times, so obviously someone who is pretty secure and probably well compensated as far as journalists go, but he also has his Substack newsletter, Freelancing with Tim, and does also exist at that intersection as well, sometimes freelancing too, and talking about the subject with a level of clarity that most people who have made it in any given industry tend not to. So I find all of that very interesting, and I want to talk to him about all of those things, plus the questions that you gave to me, /TFD, when we asked you for them. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce my guest, Tim Herrera.
Hello, thank you for that introduction. Oh my goodness, that was amazing. Wow.
Oh, wow. Yeah, man, I stuck the landing on that one. I usually mess up a couple sentences, but
That's great. Thanks for having me. Very excited to chat with you about all this stuff.
Me as well. So as I mentioned, so you're the Smarter Living editor at the New York Times. So first and foremost, what does that entail?
Smarter Living at the Times is kind of the home kind of center base for service journalism. And we define that very broadly. Essentially, what it boils down to, any story that helps readers live a better life, whatever form that takes. So that's everything from like how to pack a suitcase for a long-term trip, to a lot of personal finance stuff, which is one of the areas that I cover, to health, to cooking, all that stuff. It really has given me a very wide purview. I think it's like the best job in journalism because I literally just get paid to learn stuff. It's a pretty sweet gig.
That's amazing. And so you also, in your spare time, run the Freelancing with Tim newsletter, and I think also maybe a podcast with that?
Yeah, so it started just as a newsletter and a series of panels that I do every Sunday. I bring on industry veterans and people who've been around for a while. And really, we're just going to talk about the business of freelancing, how to get paid, how to get paid more, how to break in, and then with, some specialties along the way. But in a broad sense, the kind of core reason that I wanted to start that was freelancing in general is very opaque and can be really difficult to get into because there's not really a playbook and there's not a ton of resources out there for folks who want to get in. There are some resources, but sometimes they can cost a bit. So everything that we do, we really did it with the intention of making everything free. And the overarching goal is really just to kind of lower the barrier of entry to journalism and make the kind of baseline knowledge, the foundational things that everybody needs to know, just super open and accessible. So it's a newsletter. You can subscribe at freelancingwithtim.substack.com. And then the panels are on a bit of a hiatus, but we'll be getting back in the next month or two.
Excellent. So I do want to talk about freelancing and all of that stuff, but I want to start with the topic of wage transparency, salary transparency, all of that, because that applies to both freelancers, but also people who work in an employee capacity. So tell me a little bit about what got you into talking about wage transparency and kind of some of the work you do around it.
Yeah, so this is one of my favorite things to write about, one of my favorite things to talk about. A lot of the stories that I've written and edited in Smarter Living around wage transparency and salary discussions, a lot of it, is a little bit less centered on the actual money itself. It's more dealing with the kind of psychological component. Because, the reason that we don't like to talk about this stuff is because it's uncomfortable, and it's uncomfortable because we don't talk about it. So it's this weird kind of self-reinforcing cycle. And, the only way off that hamster wheel is just to talk about it. So I've written a lot about just the importance of sharing your salary with coworkers, being open about what expectations are when you're taking on a new job or a new assignment, sharing as much knowledge that you can with your network, your peer group, and really just kind of taking away the stigma of talking about this stuff. The only reason that it has the kind of weird hold over our minds is that we kind of give it that power. And so talking about it kind of takes that away. So I was drawn to it just because it's something that I have always really kind of just been pretty open about. And I think the more comfortable we get talking about this stuff, it's a net win for everybody. There's really no downside to talking about this stuff. And in journalism, I would even say over the last couple of years, there has been I don't know, maybe not quite a shift, but I think a lot of us have gotten a lot more comfortable with talking about this kind of stuff. I don't know if you remember last year or 2 years ago, maybe it was actually somebody at Wirecutter, a New York Times company, started a spreadsheet of you could anonymously put in your salary, and it got hundreds and hundreds of answers. And that felt to me like, kind of a little bit of a watershed moment. And I think it just made us all realize that if we don't talk about this stuff, there's no way to advocate fully for ourselves. And so, I just think it's so important. Whatever level a person is at, whatever they are, full-time, part-time, freelance, whatever it is, the only way to, kind of get yours is to, be open and talk about it with other people.
Do you share your salary publicly?
I share it with any coworker who asks, and I tweet about this all the time. Like I've tweeted my salary history a ton. Like anytime I see that there's like people talking about it on Twitter, I always jump in because I just love talking about it. And it's being at the Times and being in a place where I do have some level of comfort and stability, I do you very sincerely feel like there's a responsibility on people in those positions to be really open and to be really transparent, to help folks who are earlier on in their career, set expectations, but also make sure that they're getting what they're worth. And I remember when I started out, my very first job, I accepted the first offer. Like I didn't negotiate it. I didn't really know that you could negotiate an offer. And it was my first job. Like I didn't want to like fuck up the opportunity, right? So I just kind of took whatever they gave me. And looking back, I wish somebody had told me like, thank you for the offer, but like, this is something that's negotiable. That's just not something that I knew. And so it's really, again, important, I think, for people who are somewhat established in a career to make sure that younger people and people who are earlier on in the career know that you can negotiate. And here is kind of some, just some data that you can put into those conversations.
When it comes to both negotiating and haggling, I feel like one of the ultimate sort of life secrets is that people who don't have much money or experience with money feel like they don't even know they can do it, or they're embarrassed to do it, or they think it will make them seem, a certain type of way. But meanwhile, rich people are the cheapest motherfuckers on the planet, and they will haggle over everything. They will negotiate over everything. Like, it's unbelievable how much people who have money and comfort with money then become amongst the people who are most demanding in negotiations.
Yeah, I totally agree. And like, even, just the fact that I like am at a point in my career where like I do have that stability, like that's why I'm comfortable talking about this stuff. Like it's still, for people who don't have that stability, like it is still really intimidating, right? And it's just, and you're totally right. Like when when I had less money, I was much less good with money. And now that I'm like, a decade into a career, like I've gotten much better at money because I kind of have a little bit, not that I'm rich by any means, but it just kind of, I feel like the only way that people ever get good with money is when they already kind of are at a place where they have a little bit. And, if I wish I had been better with money, like when I was like 23 and starting out, with my first job, like I would be in such a better position. And, that's like a big regret. Like all the opportunity and all the savings that I could have now had I started being good at money, 10 years ago, it's just like gone. Like I'm never going to get that back. And, that's again, another reason I think it's so important for early career people to like figure this stuff out really early on. Because, as like there's only a very small handful of things you actually need to know about money. Like the rest is just like, people on YouTube trying to get rich off telling people how to make money. But truthfully, like you get the 4 or 5 core things down, and that's pretty much it. I know that's something that I write about all the time. Like people, it's such a non-complicated topic, but we just have this association with it that feels really intimidating and daunting. And I think that prevents a lot of people from like taking a hard look at their finances and actually getting good with money.
I completely agree. In practical terms, because that's obviously kind of the space that you inhabit from a journalism perspective, how do you recommend that people start the conversations, both as someone with more power and financial stability in an organization and someone without it?
So I think the first thing is just to reach out to people and ask if you can have a frank and open, honest conversation. I think we can start with freelancers. So I think it's really, really important for freelancers to network widely and build a kind of a lateral network of people who are in similar career stages. And those are the people that I think it's most important to have these types of conversations with. I think as someone with a full-time job, this is just something I've observed, but I feel like freelancers are a lot more open talking about rates than folks who are staff, as just been my experience. And I think it's great. Again, it's so difficult to be a freelancer, and so much about doing the work is very opaque. But I do feel like salary and rate transparency, rather, has become kind of norm, which I think is great. Like I see freelancers all the time tweeting about their rates, asking about rates, all that stuff. So I think just having the conversations with other people and not approaching it in a weird way. Like it's only weird if you make it weird, right? And then in terms of folks who are like staff or full-time or whatever it is, again, it just starts with your peer group and your peer level and kind of getting a baseline. And then from there, I think it's important to look at people who are doing the job that you want to be doing or are in a position that you want to be in, and see if they can, kind of open the kimono a little bit and share at least their history, their salary history to that point. People will share what they want to share. You won't always get an answer, but you're never going to get an answer if you don't ask. And the reason to do that is so that when the time comes that you're negotiating a salary, negotiating a raise, up for a new position, whatever it may be, you have some data so that you're not just kind of pulling numbers out of thin air. There's a lot of resources like salary.com or like Glassdoor, and like those are okay, but like I've found that they're pretty inaccurate and not super useful, generally speaking. So the best resource that we have is just like the people we know who are, again, like doing things that we're doing or doing things we want to be doing, and just sharing, being back and forth and not being, again, it's really weird if we make it weird, right?
Yeah. But it does feel really weird if you're not used to doing that at all. When I got my first job, my first full-time job, which paid $36,000 a year, which in New York City is not a lot of money, let me tell you that. I remember at one point when I was being offered that, I literally said to my then boss, I would do this job for free. Which is like the worst thing you could possibly say. I mean, I don't know what the hell was wrong with me that I was saying that, but I just had no concept, like you were saying, that negotiation was possible. I had no concept. I didn't know what Glassdoor was. I didn't know what to look up as far as what would have been a comparable salary. And I also didn't really know the value of my work. And I think that's also part of the problem is that I think a lot of people who work for an organization, or even to an extent freelancers and contractors, they don't always realize when something they're doing is very valuable and where they could probably leverage themselves a lot more. For example, if there's something that is, sponsored by a corporate entity, or it's something that's on a serious time constraint, or it's something that has a very particular set of requirements for the person who does it. Like there are a lot of instances where, because there are instances being on the perspective of, the business owner who's paying these people, you do sometimes have a feeling of like there are things that we pay for that we don't even pay that much for comparatively, but they lose us money still. Like they're not money makers. However, there are a lot of things where we do make a considerable amount of money off of them. And I feel like part of the problem is not knowing where what you're doing is really creating value.
Right. And I feel like, one of the reasons that we like get into that kind of rut is because like we don't have these like frank and open and honest conversations. And I think getting, understanding your value and what you contribute that's like the biggest piece of knowledge you keep in your back pocket. So again, when the time comes, like, what you're worth. Like I remember like my first job out of school, I was a reporter at a newspaper here in New York. I made 45,000. And like, again, like you're like an idiot 22-year-old, like I thought that was amazing. Like there's more money than I ever thought I was gonna make. And like, I just didn't know that it was up for debate, that I could negotiate it. But also I just like, I was so new to the industry, and these types of conversations, at least in the circles that I was in, were just not happening. And so I didn't know that like reporters in New York can make more than $45,000 a year. The other thing, like I was at that paper for almost 4 years. And by the time I left, I think I was making like 46,800 or something. So like over almost 4 years, I got, annual increases, basically cost of living adjustments of like what was like, I don't know what, $400 or $500 a year. And like at the time, like I was just like happy to get any raise. But those were such crucial years that I just wasn't earning, what I could have earned elsewhere. And it's just, again, like just like lost opportunity. Like those are years that I'll never have to like go back to, that I just didn't save and didn't have the opportunities to, advocate for myself. And again, because I just like didn't know that you could do that. And, it's so intimidating when you're young and like, you're just thrilled to have a job that it's, you don't want to talk your way out of having a job. And like that, that's something that I talk on my freelance panels with, and something I talk with freelancers all the time, that there's simply no downside to asking. Like there's no editor in the world who's going to rescind an assignment because you asked for a rate increase. Worst case scenario, you don't get it. There are every so often I'll hear from a freelancer who, gets like a shitty response from an editor, or makes them feel bad for asking or whatever it is. And, in the moment, like that sucks. And that's, a really awful position to be in. But more broadly, like that's more data that you have. Now you can go back to your network. It's like, that guy's an asshole. Like, don't work for him. He took away an assignment because I asked for more. Like that's still, terrible in the moment, but it's like data that you can kind of build into your financial knowledge, and that you can kind of use moving forward on whether you want to like continue to work for that publication or whatever it may be. But it's, it's hard and it's scary. And, there's such a power dynamic when, especially for freelancers, that you just, you're so worried and things are so precarious that you just don't want to do the wrong thing or say the wrong thing or rub an editor the wrong way. But having been an editor for 5 years on the other side of that, there's literally no downside to asking.
100%. Although, funnily enough, I will say, I often will, sort of broad strokes paint a portrait that, it's always worth asking for more money because usually companies can afford it, is the thing. However, in the case of, and I hate this word, a bootstrapped business of, a dozen people or whatever, like we are, oftentimes we really can't pay much more for a job, especially. So we just we list the rates for everything. Like anytime we put a job listing, we put how much it pays, because that way also the applicant pool can kind of self-select, someone who's applying for the job. Like if we say it pays, $80,000 a year, $40 an hour, whatever it pays, and they need twice that, they're not going to apply. So in terms of another area to really push people on, and I've seen people starting to do this more and more, is demanding that salaries be listed and making that more and more of a norm. And especially if you work for a company in any kind of HR capacity or have any relation to how these jobs get listed, I do feel like that's a massive benefit, kind of again on both sides. It's good for, the people who are applying for the job who may have otherwise undervalued themselves. Also, if it's a terrible rate for the job, their ass gets exposed. But also on the other side, you're not getting candidates who are wildly sort of misaligned.
Right. And it's so frustrating. And like, I hate that it's just like so difficult to get that information. Like a couple weeks ago, I was helping a friend apply for a job, and we're going through the application process, and, we're looking at the color and everything. And it was through, Workday. The listing was in Workday, and we're going through it. It literally, you couldn't progress past a certain point unless you listed a salary. Like you had to list a salary. And, that just takes away all the power from the applicant and puts it all into the employer. Because, forcing someone to list their salary, if they're, say, well under the cap for that position, like, you just took away that applicant's complete negotiating power. And it's so frustrating. And it, like you're saying, like, it's not good for anybody involved. Like making it such a secret, winnows the application, or winnows the application pool in ways that are counterproductive for, trying to build out a team. And I think it's so frustrating. And like, I don't have a solution for it, and I don't see that changing. And so it really just comes down to what we keep saying, like, you just have to have these conversations with your peer group and with people who are doing the jobs that you want to be doing. I wish that weren't the case, but like it is. And then the other thing I will say is there's a couple of Twitter accounts that are really, really aggressive about forcing, particularly editors, when they list like they're looking for freelancers, forcing them to put rates, which I think is great. Like there's this really good Twitter account. It's called Writers of Color. And they like retweet calls for work and calls for position and everything. But they reply to every single post, every single listing and say, what is the rate? What does this pay? And unless the person follows through and gives the rate, they like won't promote that, won't retweet it or whatever. And I think that's just so great. And, I think the conversations happening around this stuff on Twitter, like I've, been in the industry for 12 years now. And like, I've never seen people talk so openly about rates and about transparency. And I hope that continues. And I think, honestly, I think the pandemic like did kind of force a lot of those conversations to happen, just because like how much it fucked up the industry and newsrooms shuttered and budgets were slashed and everything, that, we really had to have these discussions, because like everybody, even, people who have staff jobs were in such precarious positions that we really need to like make sure that our financial stability is taken care of. And I think it's been so great. And like, the stuff that I'm writing at the Times and conversations I've had with freelancers, it's just been, I think, again, just been my experience. Like it does feel like we as an industry are at a place where we're like fine having these conversations. Like it's not weird. Like that was certainly not the case, when I started out and had my first job. Like that, it was still like you just don't talk about that stuff. But I think it's so encouraging and so heartening to see like all these conversations on Twitter, like all day people talking about rates, sharing rates, talking about salaries, all this stuff. It's great. I love it.
Writers of Color is the most effortlessly withering Twitter because, well, first of all, it's like my life's goal for every position we hire for is like never like get sort of like effortlessly taken down, because basically like to your point, people will be like, we have this amazing job, like freelance, social, whatever creator. And, the job's like kind of a long description, and they just respond like, what does it pay? And then to your point, sometimes people don't even respond because I'm sure it pays absolute shit, if anything. But then sometimes people respond and it's a terrible rate. So what they'll do is they'll like quote tweet the job listing that's all like, do this amazing fun thing. And they'll be like $200, like literally just effortlessly exposing that this is clearly a shit job, that they're not compensating fairly whatsoever. So, and I know that there are a lot of other industry specific ones. Like my husband works in tech, and there's a lot of like, forums and subreddits, those guys are all on Reddit, and Twitters and things like that, where they talk about pay, and also especially things like gender and ethnic breakdowns in, different companies. And there are a lot of industry specific places to follow for each of these. And lastly, I feel like on that note, I feel like two like really universal things that extend to any industry. One is that we often as employees have a tendency, employees often have a tendency to underestimate how terrible it is for an employer to have to rehire for a position in many cases. Like most employers, unless, they're terrible or they don't at all value their staff, which does happen, but in a lot of cases it doesn't, like they do not want to have to hire a new person. It costs money. It costs time, which is money. It's very difficult. You're not going to necessarily find the right person for it very quickly, all of that stuff. So you staying and your continuity is often very valuable. It's a similar reason why it's often better for a landlord to give you a rent discount than to just rent it out again. But the other thing is that usually when it comes to employees, the only times you're going to get your really big raises, unless you work for a great employer, is going to another company and then coming back to your boss and being like, you want me to stay? It costs this much.
Yeah. I so agree. And like literally, like this is another thing that I had no idea about early on, that like I had to learn, and that people had to like tell me that like you're totally right. Like staying is an asset. Like it is so difficult to find people, so difficult to hire, and people don't know that. And I think that piece of knowledge alone like is such an important negotiating tool to have. And just knowing that, like again, like you're saying, the continuity of just you being there, like that is an argument you can make. And like I hate there's, I don't know, like it's really frustrating that I think in a lot of places, the way to get a raise or to get a promotion is to go out, get a job offer, and then bring that back. And it sucks. It's so much effort, and like it's again one of those things that's bad for employees. It's bad for employers, and yet we all are just kind of stuck in this loop. Like there's I have a friend who works at a national magazine, and that's basically like an unwritten rule that like the only way you're really going to get like a significant salary bump or promotion is to go out, get another offer, and then bring it back. And like that's like, I don't know, why withhold like rewards to employees who are like good employees and who have stuck around for a while and like know the ropes and are good at their job. It's these hoops that we have to jump through. Like it's just such a broken system. And again, it's like something that I don't have a fix for, and I wish it were different. But like, yeah, like even like that's a conversation that, like we have at the Times. It's thankfully it's not usually the situation, but like it's something that we all joke about, like, oh yeah, like yeah, I need a raise, so I should go out and get an offer. I think we've gotten a lot better at that, but I know a lot of places that is still the case, and it's so frustrating and so much wasted effort for like all parties involved. But who knows what the solution is? Like, I don't know. I wish I had an answer to that.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I feel like obviously the employer in that case is just trying to maximize the amount of time that they can get away with paying that lower rate, obviously, until their hand is forced. Although I do feel like if an employer is savvy, they're going to just try and preempt those things because they don't even want that person, because it takes up time and energy from the person to be out there getting another offer, like working with a headhunter or whatever they're going to be doing to like go get that offer, bring it back so we can do the dance and then I can get the raise. Like I don't understand that. But I will say also when it comes to whether it's opening negotiations, whether it's looking for a raise, because I do think, and it really is on a good employer to make sure that their employees are being compensated and, adjusted fairly. However, I do think a lot of, especially women, which is the vast majority of our audience, don't advocate for themselves enough to get raises. Like they don't do it regularly enough. They don't feel that they even know the way to do it. And one of the best recommendations that I can't take credit for, this is actually our dear friend, Erin Lowry of Broke Millennial.
Love Erin.
Erin's the best. Yeah. Oh my God. Look at that. Another Erin stan in the house. Who would have thought? So one thing she recommends doing is whatever job you're working, including even as a contractor, keep a success folder that just has important metrics, things that you do that are already above and beyond your job scope, things that you do, ways that you've noticed yourself being ahead of the curve on things, comparative market research on, what you're working on versus what other companies are doing. Basically everything that you would need to quantifiably advocate for yourself to get a raise or to, be bumped up in whatever capacity. And again, that can happen at the opening negotiation and you can bring that with you from another job, or it can happen in a current job. And I think it also applies to contractors if you're working regularly with a client. But I think the important thing is to not wait for your employer to come to you if you're already working there. Like, obviously, any opening offer at a job, like that's a negotiation right there. You should be at least trying to get more money, because any employer who's going to say to you, oh, you asked for more money, we don't want to give you the job anymore. That does happen very occasionally, but that's a terrible fucking employer and you've dodged a bullet. But especially if you already work there, like don't wait for your employer to come to you and say, we're ready to give you a raise. Like you come, be super professional, say, I've put together this dossier for you to take a look at. I've pulled these numbers from comparable, companies in the industry. I'm very happy here, but would love to kind of adjust myself upward to a more appropriate rate. And I think to your point, just be super unapologetic because you're doing it because you deserve it.
Yep. I 1,000,000% agree with everything you just said. On your very last point, like that is another thing that it took me a long time to figure out. And that I think, particularly like with freelancers, because when you're freelancing, really the industry in general, because, journalism is so, stability just doesn't exist. We're just so grateful to have a job, to have an assignment, to be working for XYZ publications, that we just don't want to rock the boat. But what it took me years to figure out was like, we don't do jobs like out of kindness. Like it's an exchange. Right. Like we're doing this job, we're taking this assignment, we're doing X, whatever it is, for money. And so looking at a job from the perspective of like, it plays into the whole like, oh, like we're family here, which is like such a toxic thing to say, but like, no, like we're not family. Like this is not a family. Like this is a company. Like I come here to get money and you pay me to do these things. Like that's all there is to it. Like it's a very specific exchange. Like, it's perfectly fine, of course, to have warm relationships with your coworkers and love the work that you do and be passionate about it. But at the end of the day, like, it doesn't matter how passionate you are about your job or how much you love your coworkers, like you are still expendable because this is still a business. And, we just kind of need to shift the way that we think and look at this as, again, just like an exchange, right? There's nothing more to it. A job is a job. Like, I don't believe in the idea of dream jobs. I don't believe in any job being a calling. Like we do things to get money. Like if we didn't have to pay rent or have expenses, like we would just like hang out all day and do things that we enjoy. That is not the case for most of us, but it is just a job. And then two other things that you said that I do just really want to echo is keeping that wins folder throughout the year. And we just finished up last month our annual reviews. And, I think for people who are in, full-time positions, it's easy to kind of just fall into the tendency of only reflecting on your accomplishments and your wins over the past year around review time, or like if you have like a yearly check-in or whatever it may be. But something that I've been doing for years is anytime I do something that I think was great or that I, had a big accomplishment or big achievement, like I have a folder in my inbox, like I send an email to myself, which is like a couple bullet points about like what it was, why it was so good, why it's worth talking about. And so the end of the year comes and it's, review season and I'm writing myself an evaluation. I can basically just like copy and paste that email because I've already kept track of everything that I've done over the year. So I've been doing that for years. And then the other thing is when we're talking about asking for raises. So one thing that I do want to just tack on is that companies handle raises differently, and it's easy. And I think kind of default to only talk about raises around evaluation season, and that's something that I did for years. But I, at the times, like I had a wonderful mentor who kind of walked me through what the process actually looks like and what the timing looks like, and that piece of knowledge alone is so invaluable because again, every company's different, but when budget time happens, a lot of the times the decisions about who's getting raises, who's getting how much, like that stuff is set in stone. And when evaluation comes or yearly check-in, like the decision's already been made. And so like I like literally coach people at work, and like people know that I do this, and so people like reach out to me specifically about like when and how to ask for a raise because like I figured out the system. And I think figuring that out for wherever you work, whatever your workplace is so important and such a crucial aspect of salary negotiations and asking for raises. And I think it's really overlooked. Like timing alone, you don't always want to use that default of just talking about money and talking about raises around evaluation season because like the decision may have already been made by then. Maybe not, maybe that company is different, but you need to at least kind of know what the timing looks like and what the processes can look like.
I think that's such an excellent point. And I also think that it's important to, I think too often to your earlier point about this being an exchange, right? Which reminds me of our Depression King, Don Draper, and his famous "That's what the money's for" line, which is like one of the best scenes in television history. But he was right. The man was right. That's what the money's for, Peggy. Wait your turn. Anyway, no, but that did remind me quite a lot of, this dynamic that I think that employees and especially freelancers often fall into, where they're really made to feel grateful. Like you should be grateful to have a job. Like, fuck that. They should be grateful that you're such a great, reliable employee who's doing this work for the company because, not to take this to the capitalism discourse, but like if you're working for a company, chances are you're producing value in surplus of what you're being paid. That's capitalism. So clearly you're doing them a favor, if anything. I got too heated. But in all seriousness, what?
I was just, it's so important. And, I don't want to, belabor the point and we can move on, but like, for me, it was such a paradigm shift on how I looked at jobs and careers. Because for years, like I was just so grateful to like be getting jobs. And, in an industry like journalism or media in general, jobs are really difficult to come by. And so when you happen to get one, like you are just so overjoyed and you really don't want to rock the boat and you don't want to let this opportunity slip through your fingers. And it's really intimidating. Like when I started, my job at the Washington Post a couple of years ago, I like didn't negotiate my salary at all. I on the application, it has a little slot to put your requirements, right? And I didn't negotiate because I was just so thrilled to get a job at the Washington Post that when the offer came through, like I didn't, and they even, they gave me a $1,000 more than I had put down. My starting salary there was $70,000. And so when the offer came, I was just like, holy shit, like I got a job at the Post, like it pays $1 million. And I didn't even think to negotiate. And then I learned after I left that the cap for the team that I was on was, if I remember right, it was 80, 82, something like that. And I could have had that if I had just literally asked. And I know that because I'm so close friends with the person who hired me. And we like have had very frank conversations about money and salaries. And like literally that was just like money on the table that all of that could have been mine. I could have made $10,000 more if I literally just like asked. But I was just like too intimidated because I was like, oh my God, this is the best job ever. Like I should just be grateful. But like, no, like they should be grateful that they got me to accept their offer. But it's, I think just such a powerful shift in thinking that it took me years to develop. And but it has, influenced it's influenced everything that I write about careers, influenced everything I write about money. And it's influenced like my approach to my own career. Be happy to have a job if you have one, happy to have work if you do. But again, don't be grateful that they're handing you an assignment, a job, whatever it is. Like, no, like you need to advocate for yourself because you have value, you contribute value. And I think that's something that we don't, it seems like such a small thing, but I think looking at careers in that way, again, for me, my experience has just completely shaped how I like think about money and what I think about careers.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like on the being grateful tip, like your employer should always be very cognizant of the fact that you could leave for a better job. Like I do feel like a lot of people in salaried positions of all kinds get into a place where it's just a good enough job to keep them around. The salary's just good enough that it prevents them from because especially once you get a little bit further into your career, looking for another job sucks. Like, especially while you have a job, you have to be all sneaky about it. You sometimes have to go through a headhunter. Like, it's a whole nother job unto itself to look for a different job. So most people don't want to do that. Also, there's the sort of familiarity bias of, this job, you're more comfortable at it, et cetera. And I do feel like that often keeps people way too complacent at a job, and therefore their employer becomes way too complacent. And I feel like when you bring up, for example, you were mentioning earlier, bringing up that raise conversation at the time that is, sensible to their budget cycles, but also to you and not just at your annual review, I think the conversation should be very explicitly like, I really like it here. I really enjoy my work here. However, just on a sheer competitive level, I'm not really at the level I need to be at for this job. And you can bring a couple of, data points to support that and say, I'd love to make this work here, but we got to make sure we're kind of on the level. Because that is the nature of the job. And chances are, if they had to go out and hire another person to replace you, they'd probably have to pay them more.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like my very first job, like I said, I was there for almost 4 years. And those were like, I'm earning years that I should have been, making more money, but I liked my job enough. I liked my coworkers, and, for, a 22-year-old, like $45,000 is a shit ton of money. But it's just, I stayed there, not necessarily because I loved it and was being paid enough. But it was like easy, and like the whole job hunt process is just so daunting, such a hassle. But like the truth is, like, if you gotta leave a job, like leave a job. Like there's no perfect job, there's no dream job. And I think there's always like something better out there. Like I love my job, like I love my coworkers, I love the work that I do, but like I'm sure there's like a better job for me somewhere. But I'm happy where I am. But I don't want to be married to it. I don't think anybody should ever be married to anything. And I think this is kind of another conversation, but I think having kind of a plan B that you can call on is another crucial component of building like one's financial security and financial life. It's something that I talk a lot on the freelance panels about. But I think having a plan B. I mean, that plan B may just be like 6 months of savings. Like having that, I think it gives you a little bit of a level of comfort. It's like, well, you remember years ago, I forget who wrote it. There was that woman who wrote that super famous post about having a fuck you account.
A fuck off fund.
What's that?
Her name is Paulette Perhatch.
Yeah. Oh yeah, the fuck you. Right. Yeah. The fuck you fund. And that does give you a real sense of sense of safety, obviously. But I think it makes being less dependent on the one thing that you do for money is just it's kind of freeing, and it does give you kind of like lets you take some power back, right? Like if things like got super bad at your job, and it's like, you know what, I'm out. Like I can like chill for a couple months. I don't need to put up with the shit. But if you don't have that fuck you fund, that's just not even an option. Like it's not on the table, and I think that keeps people in unhappy positions. And we can talk about more savings and how to build the savings. But I think just the psychological benefit of having that, really, like I said, lets you take a little bit of power back and gives you a little bit of leverage. So that way, if you are in a position where like things are just really not great, like you can kind of go out the escape hatch.
I love that. So we had some questions from our audience about both, employees and freelancers that I'd love to get to. How do you know if you are being how do you know if you're being paid fairly based on your experience or title?
Talk to people. That's pretty much it. There's a handful of people on Twitter who are like super open about this stuff, following blogs like this, and then just kind of getting a sense of who in your industry is making what, and who the people that are doing the job you want to be doing, like what are they making? And you can kind of work backward and kind of see what their career trajectory was and how they got there, and kind of build your own version of that plan. And like maybe you just want to mimic the steps they took, like great, cool. But there's you want to kind of build something of a plan to get where you want to be. But the only way to arm yourself with that knowledge is just to talk to people and have frank and open conversations about this stuff.
Also, Glassdoor, obviously, go to Glassdoor and look for industry-specific places where people are sharing their salary. There's tons of there's even private Facebook groups and stuff where people do it.
Yeah. Oh, and actually, that just struck my memory. If I can do one more little plug, last summer, maybe it was in the fall, on Freelancing with Tim, I did a whole newsletter about freelance rates. And I literally just tweeted editors, tweet me your standard rate, whatever it is, whatever. And so that, I think it was last summer we did that. But stuff like that, for freelancers, I think a lot of these conversations happen on Twitter, and I think people are really, really open about this stuff. But just kind of ask and talk to folks.
I agree. How do you handle being the only person in your office who understands work-life balance?
Yeah. I feel like my answer to this would have been completely different pre-pandemic. But and this is something that I've written a lot about, that just because the lines between work and personal life are essentially non-existent, right? We're all working from home. I'm literally sitting at my kitchen table. This is where before I was going to the office, where I did my work for a year. And so I think, last fall, I wrote a story about this, and a lot of it has to do with just kind of trying to set expectations and trying to give yourself reminders, right? So one of the people that I spoke with is Art Markman. He's a marketing professor at UT. And one of the things that he suggested was in the place you're working, which probably is most people's homes right now, have physical places that are just for work, just for eating, just for sleeping, whatever it is. Which can be difficult in tiny New York apartments. But there is some benefit and value to that. It's not something that I was really able to do when I was working from home. But whatever reminders that you can set up for yourself to delineate the time between when you're on and when you're off. But it's tough. And the other, you're saying about setting expectations, I think I'm pretty good at that. And, my coworkers know that if they Slack me at 7:30, they're not going to get a response. They know that I'm not going to check my email before 8 a.m. And, I think in a lot of ways, and again, it's more difficult during the pandemic, but I think in a lot of ways we can kind of train people on how we want them to, treat us and how we want them to approach us in a work situation. And so, it's tough. Like, I don't know, like this, there are countless posts, like I've written stories about this and like, I hadn't been great about it. But I think just, it's difficult. You got to do what you can.
I agree. And I would also go one step further and say there are some employers who are absolute petty tyrants and they just care about asses being in the seat for a certain number of hours a day. And it gets into this weird passive aggressive competition between the coworkers of who stays longest and who comes earliest and all of that shit, which I've dealt with. And that is just like, you have to eventually get a new job because that's just a terrible workspace. However,
and a lot of this is just kind of spillover from the way that our managers go. Like if your manager like is on until 9 p.m. and sending you emails at 11 p.m., like that is really setting such a terrible expectation for everyone under that person. That's obviously not something you can change, but in ways that you can like manage up and again set those expectations. But it can be difficult, and in certain circumstances, it can be really, really tough.
Exactly. But I do think you can, when it comes to things like, for example, when we go back into the office for people who will be going back to the office this year, we're kind of a unique case at TFD in that we were only doing minimum 3 days a week in office before, and basically no one did 5. But a lot of people will be going back to full-time in office. I think some will do a mix. But for those who are going back full-time in office, and people who are dreading that, I think what's important to remember is that if your employer is not a petty tyrant, what they're really focused on is deliverables. They're focused on productivity. And there are actually a lot of really good studies to show that when a person's life is better adapted, they are more productive. They're more effective. So I would say if you're looking to have that conversation with a manager, like for example, you say, okay, we're going back to the office, but I would love to keep Fridays work from home. Make a quantitatively based argument as to why that will benefit your work, and make it with some real data, like maybe draw some stuff from that success folder you've been keeping, but make a case that makes sense for them from a business perspective. Because ultimately, if your work improves by keeping one day from home or by leaving at a certain time on a certain day, like that can be a net win for all, again, if the employer is even minimally good.
Yeah. And really, last thing to just tack on to that, right now, and as we kind of move back into the office, is a really, really good opportunity to have these conversations. Like there's been countless stories about this, about, workplaces and companies evaluating like whether we need to be in the office, like whether we need to like be on for 5 days. Like, I don't know if you like Spain, like just passed like the 4-day work week or something like that. And so right now these conversations are happening. And so there's like really never been a better time to have that conversation. And, I like have coworkers who are just like done with the office. Like they just like aren't going back. And like, that's great. I think there's going to be a lot of flexibility, I think, in the way and the expectations that employers have of the ways people are doing their work and where they're doing it. And I think building, like you're saying, kind of building out a plan right now for when that conversation comes up, I think can be really beneficial and kind of help people direct and guide what that return to work is going to look like if it's going to happen. But right now is like such a good time to have those conversations like that.
Totally agree. For those people who are like excited to be remote forever, how does your home not feel like a prison when you're there 24/7 working and never seeing anyone in person? I can't do one more Zoom. I can't do it. I mean, this one, sure, but not after this. So what is advice for someone? So two-parter. Advice for someone looking to start monetizing their writing for the first time, and then advice for someone who's looking to get staffed at a media company.
To what, get staff job?
To get a staff job at a media company. So break into freelance writing, then get a job as a staffer at a media company.
Got it. So the first thing I will say is that, and this is something that I've only kind of learned over the last year in talking with so many freelancers about the industry and about the business of freelancing, is that if you know how to write, that is an extremely fucking valuable skill. Like in journal, like work in journalism, work in media, like everybody around you knows how to write. And so it doesn't seem like a novel skill, and it doesn't really even seem like a marketable skill because everybody can write. But once you get out of media, out of journalism, you find that nobody knows how to write. And so it becomes like an extremely rare and novel and marketable skill. And so I would say most freelancers I know don't make all their income just from journalism writing. They supplement that with like technical writing or scientific writing or marketing or copywriting, whatever it is. So broadening out the definition of what you look at in terms of freelance work can get you so much work. And again, this is like shocking to me when I first learned this. There's this freelancer called Kim Kelly. I had her on one of my panels early on, like last year, and this is something that she said on the panel. And I at first I was like, yeah, okay, like I guess that makes sense. But the more conversations about that, every freelancer echoed that. So there's a lot of work. Writing is a really valuable and marketable skill once you get out of kind of just a media bubble and a sliver definition of what freelance work can be. So look for opportunities outside of what you might think. They also like a lot of the times can pay a lot better. Like technical writing like pays a shit ton of money. Like I have a freelance friend who does technical writing, and she gets like $4 or $5 a word. It's crazy.
Whoa.
Yeah, it's insane. So this is one thing. This is something that I always like to talk about on my panels as well. When you're kind of starting out a freelance career, it's easy to kind of intimidate yourself out of pitching XYZ publications because maybe you don't have enough clips or you don't have what you think are the right bylines, or just, you don't feel you're qualified to write for that publication. And I hate when I see this because like it's just not the case. Like the only way to get those clips and get those bylines is to go out and get those clips and get those bylines, right? You're never going to write for the New Yorker if you never pitch the New Yorker. And so I think, and this really comes up when I do panels for students and really early career journalists, is that they just don't end up pitching great stories to great publications because they just don't think they have a shot. And again, having been on the other side of that, that is just not the case. Like a great pitch with a great story, generally speaking, will outweigh kind of an inexperienced or early career writer for the right editor for the right story. When we editors commission stories like that, we do it knowing that we're kind of taking on a project and something that's going to take a little bit more time and management and all that. But we want that story, and so we're willing to work with you. So if you don't have the right bylines, the right bylines, right clips, whatever it may be, the only way to get those is to get those. So that's just a quick little tag on that. And the other thing in terms of getting a staff position, I don't know. Like I've been thinking a lot about this and a lot over the last year as I've been talking with so many freelancers. And like I know a lot of freelancers who are content to freelance and don't want a staff position. So one, I would like think through like what you are looking to get out of a staff position that you couldn't get as a freelancer. And obviously like the stability is there and health insurance is nice. But I know so many freelancers who have kind of gone through the ringer and had staff jobs and prefer freelancing. So that's a way to think about that question that hadn't really occurred to me up until a year ago when I was having all these conversations with so many freelancers. So think through like what do you actually want out of a career? Like, do you want to sacrifice flexibility and freedom for a staff position? And maybe you do. Come out of this thinking that is what you want. But I think through again like what your expectations are. And then in terms of if you decide that you do want a staff position, get good clips, figure out what you want to be doing. Like if you want to be a reporter, an editor, or social person, search person, whatever it may be, just build up the clips file, get all the right experience. And a lot of it comes down to like timing and budget cycles. It's really difficult right now just because the pandemic fucked up so many newsrooms and budgets and a lot of places like closed or just aren't hiring. So it's difficult. But yeah, I mean, I know that's kind of a squishy non-answer, but just keep at it, I guess. Perseverance.
Well, listen, we've what's 75? We've increased our staff by 75% this year.
Amazing.
So we've been doing a lot of hiring, and let me tell you, because this person was like getting a job at a media company, in parentheses, like TFD. Can't speak for them all, but I will say if it said TFD, and actually this was true with the only other media company I ever worked at, but I did hire there too. You would be shocked in this industry of, true fools. The amount, so every time we put up a listing for a job and it shares the rate and everything, so we're trying to self-select with our candidates, whatever. We go out of our way, per my recent career tip video, to put very specific instructions on how to apply for the job. 80% of the applicants do not follow the instructions in some way, shape, or form. They're out. Also, of the 20% who do, when I tell you the pleasure that it is to open an email that is beautifully formatted, clean and copy edited. You have 2 attachments if you go the extra mile to like make your cover letter and your resume like on a beautiful template that match each other. Like, oh my God, you have immediately risen to the 99th percentile of applications. And I, of course, assume that, that varies a little bit place to place, but you would be shocked at how bad so many applications are.
The whole process is awful. Yeah, I mean, and there's so it's so competitive. Like, there's so many people, and I just feel so bad. I'm not, in a position where I'm hiring or anything. But a couple of years ago, I was on the committee that helped sort through applications for our fellowship program, and that was maybe the first or second year that we had done it. And I'm sure getting the numbers wrong, but we were hiring, I think, for maybe like 15 positions, give or take, throughout the newsroom and the opinion section. And there was something like 4,000 applications for these 15 positions. And it's just it's so difficult. I don't know. I know that's not really an answer at all, but it's tough out there. I feel for people, man.
I do as well, but some of you guys, our instructions are not that hard. Read them and then reread them.
Oh, that's tough. That is a good.
No, and on the freelancing point, I do have 2 tiny little notes on that. Number 1, holy grail of writing jobs that no one thinks of, but if you get them, you're set for life. Airplane magazines. I swear to God, I never ever miss freelance writing except for writing for freaking airline magazines. It was the best job of my life.
Yes, they pay so well. Same with train magazines. I have a friend who Amtrak, whatever it is. Yeah, they pay a shit ton of money, and it's not, they're relatively easy sometimes.
Oh my God, they pay a shit ton of money because they have the highest circulation of any magazines, and people actually read them because they're so bored. So the value of the advertisements in those magazines are crazy. They will pay you $2, $3, $4 a word. They will send your ass to go travel to some random place that they fly to, so you can go eat at a restaurant and write about how great it was. That is, oh my God, mwah, those jobs. And then the other thing with freelancing is that, and I'm going to name names here, so gird your loins magazines, but when I was a freelance writer at the beginning and I was just trying to get my clips, to your earlier point about wanting to get those bylines and people being so nervous about them, that's one step. Being so nervous that you don't even pitch, that's the worst place to be. Second worst place to be is where I was, where I pitched and regularly wrote for places that I considered to be very big bylines in the day: The Atlantic, Vice. Between the 2 of them, I don't remember how many articles I did, but it was several. $0. $0 wasn't paid a damn dime for those articles.
No, what? Why? But what happened?
I literally just, okay, this is very dark, but I literally never asked about it. And I always got one of the editors later was Me Too'd. So I think I got off easy by just not getting paid by them. Yeah, actually. And then honestly, crazy story. Another editor that I wrote for at another publication that has since shuttered also didn't pay me and did get really harassy in the G chat. So wow, pre-2017 media was a wild place for a 22-year-old female writer. But anyways, the point is to say that I was just so bowled over to be writing for these publications and so excited. And my editors clearly didn't give a shit about me or know anything about me. So they weren't going to advocate for me. So I never asked for money. So they never even offered it.
That is insane. I want to say I can't believe it, but that is a not uncommon story. Yeah, you gotta chase that money down. Again, we don't, you weren't writing those articles for your health and fun. You were trying to get paid. This is a job, and people. I think it's easy to kind of romanticize the idea of being a writer and working in journals and everything. But no, it's not it's a job. Jobs generally kind of suck sometimes, but you do them to get money. And it's again freelance. There's such a power dynamic at work for freelancers because they don't have an institution backing them, and it's just them running their business for the most part. And I think it's really I don't think there are editors who are actively trying to shortchange freelancers or who are trying to take advantage of freelancers. I'm sure they're out there, but I think it's very, very uncommon. But they're certainly not going to advocate for you. They don't work for you, they work for the company. And so nobody's advocating for you except you. So you gotta keep that in mind, and you're not doing them a favor, and they're not doing you any favors. This is again an exchange. You are going to do this work for this money. Last quick thing on that is I've heard so many horror stories from freelancers who kind of like you, who started an assignment, took on an assignment, not knowing what the rate was going to be, not knowing in your case that you were going to get paid. So just last quick thing on that is never ever start work on an assignment until you have an agreed upon rate in an email. Verbal rate over the phone is not good enough. Get it in an email. Don't start a lick of work until you get that email with your rate. That's it.
True that. So we have one last audience question before we get to our rapid fires. What is the practical difference between salary transparency and advocating for it at a small company versus a large company?
So that's a good question. And I also want to hear your perspective on this too. So I generally, I've only really worked in one small company, and my experience, and I'm curious what you have experienced, but my experience was that transparency at the small company was much less frequent than at the big companies I've worked for. And like, I have a theory about that, but I don't know if it's true. Like my theory is that it's easier when you work at a huge company to look at it as just like kind of a faceless corporate entity. And so I think it makes people a little more comfortable being like, yeah, this is what I make. Like, fuck this company. Like, we got to get paid. Whereas when I was at a small company, like people felt a lot more invested in it, and maybe it was a little more personal. I don't know if that's the case, but like every large company I've worked for has been much, the employees have been much more comfortable sharing salaries and salary transparency. But again, like I've really only kind of worked at big companies. But I'm curious, what's your experience been like around it?
Well, we're very transparent. I mean, we do everything but like literally just like publish everyone's salary because we do believe they deserve their right to privacy. But like at the end of the year, we like go over the whole company budget with everyone. So you can, I mean, if you do the math, you can basically figure it out. Also, it's just a way to be like, this is what we're working with here. So, make all your decisions within that, kind of matrix. I did only ever work for another media company that was very small. However, from an HR perspective, a bit of a Chernobyl situation. It was an absolute nightmare on every HR level possible. I did find out after leaving that I was being dramatically underpaid on so many different axes, but honestly, I consider myself lucky that that was the only real issue that I experienced in that regard. It could have been much, much worse. Just in terms of, the blowback that could have come from working in those conditions. But all of that is to say, I agree with you that in terms of being able to speak much more neutrally and have a sense, I think being a large organization, both from the perspective that it's like a sort of anonymous entity and also from the perspective that there's enough of you that there can be anonymity to some extent, does help facilitate the conversation. Like you can get like a Google Sheets going that people can start filling in. Whereas if you work at a company with, 15, 20 people, everyone knows who everyone is, so you basically have to go straight transparency with that. However, I will say that with rare exception, so it is actually illegal for an employer to fire you for talking about what you earn with another coworker. But with rare exception, starting that conversation with a coworker that's very quid pro quo, and you don't obviously start by revealing the number, but if you just start that ball rolling, most coworkers, I think it's fair to say, will be receptive to it.
Yeah, like I because I write about this so much and because I've written so much specifically about salary transparency, like I probably know like more salaries than anybody except the HR department at times. But I've never been in a position where I opened that conversation or tried to nudge someone in that direction and gotten like a cold response or like, they were like rude about it or anything. Like I feel like people want to talk about this stuff. And I think like, the hardest part is just starting that conversation. But like literally I've never like had a bad experience just starting the conversation. Sometimes people will share what they want, and if they don't want to share, they won't, which is totally fine. But I've never had anybody like give like an adverse reaction to just trying to start that conversation. The hardest part is just having it. But I've never, there's not really any downside in my experience. I think people are more willing to discuss this stuff with coworkers than I think we broadly speaking kind of think.
Yeah, I mean, especially at places like the Times, and you are not expected to even nod or blink your eyes in response to this, but you guys got some people on the payroll that are making like 7 figures or close to it that you're like, that person shouldn't even be able to write publicly. So hopefully also by getting a little bit, of that transparency going around the people who are not paid as well, you can start to be like, well, this isn't fair because for every 15 of us, there's one of those guys who's like constantly getting us in trouble with his terrible opinions.
Yeah. I mean, I just keep going back to that Google sheet with everybody's salaries. There was a ton of time salaries on there too. But that was just, I think, so helpful. And like, I've never seen anything like that. I think it was great. But it was like interesting, like, seeing coworkers and seeing what other folks at your level are making. It's just like, so important to have these conversations.
100%. So the time has come, Tim. Prepare. We are about to get into our rapid fire questions. So, let's go off the dome with these. What is the big financial secret of the journalism industry, your industry?
Oh, whoa, good. Big financial secrets of the journalism industry. Okay, so this might be controversial, but I think there's a lot more money out there than people think. Like, I know freelancers who are making like $1.50, $2 a word, writing for the same places everybody else writes for. And I think people don't know that, and so they don't ask for it. But I think there are a lot of places that pay shit, and it's certainly rare that a company or outlet will pay well. But I think it's more common than people think.
What do you invest in versus what are you cheap about?
It's interesting. It's difficult for me to answer that because I don't really I don't budget. I don't really think about it because I've set up automatic systems essentially that do all the budgeting for me, and so I don't really think a lot about money. Like I wrote a story last year, actually right around this time, about the journey that my paycheck takes, and the money isn't deposited into my account until it's made like 3 or 4 stops, and so automating all that stuff like has done away with my need to like really budget or save because that stuff automatically happens and I just don't think about it. So I don't know. Like I don't really think a lot about it. I don't know. That's a good question. Well, let me come back to it. Let me think of that a bit more on that.
Well, that is a good thing to be doing, what you're doing. What has been your best investment and why?
This is going to sound cheesy, but I'll say getting good with money itself. Just because, like we said at the top, like there's literally like 4 or 5 things to know about money. And like, once you know those 4 or 5 things, like that's it. And like, I didn't learn these things until a couple of years ago. But since then, money is just like not really something I think about because I'm good with it. Like I set up systems so that I don't have to think about it. It's not a stressor. Like I'm never pinching pennies because I've already put in the work to build those systems. And I know it's kind of a cheesy answer, but invest in your own personal finance knowledge.
That's the best answer. What has been your biggest money mistake and why?
Not saving early on. I left my first job after 4 years making, $45,000 a year, $46,000 a year. After those 4 years, I left with like $2,000 in savings total, like retirement, savings account, checking. My net worth was like $2,000 after 4 years of working. Like that is just like, I have so much regret that like I didn't figure this stuff out earlier on. That's just like money I'll like never be able to make up for. And it's just such a stupid mistake. And like, it's again like such a dumb cheesy thing to say, but like the more work you put in early on in your career, like the returns are just like so much more massive than anything you could ever make up for. And it's just I wish I had known and figured out much sooner.
Love it. What is your biggest current money insecurity?
I think having it, I don't know, I would say like I probably have like one of the like most stable jobs in journalism, but like the industry is just so shaky, and every one of us is in such a precarious situation that like I do have a lot of anxiety about like waking up one day and like, oh, it's like layoff season and something drastic happening like that. And I was like tweeting about this a couple of weeks ago, just wondering if there are industries where you aren't living in this state of constant anxiety that you're going to lose your job. And like, it turns out there kind of are. And that's just like not something, I think the idea of stability in journalism is just something you kind of have to come to terms with, that it's something you're never going to have. So I like do have anxiety about like the kind of floor falling out and kind of being left out.
What has been the financial habit that has helped you the most?
Not budgeting or saving money. So like I was saying, I don't budget and I don't save because when my again, like the journey that my paycheck takes, I'm literally like the fourth stop on that journey, right? So first I maxed out 401k employee contribution match, max out an IRA. I put around I want to say like 40% directly into a separate savings account that I did that's difficult for me to get access to. And I have an individual investment account, and then that I contribute to automatically. So after all those 4 or 5 whatevers, that's when it hits my personal checking account, and that's the money that I can use. So like I don't have to think about budgeting or saving because I don't do it.
That's a method. That's the paying yourself first method,
Mm-hmm.
which is a budget. It's just you've already pre-budgeted, so you don't have to think about the rest. Last question, when did you first feel successful, and what does that word mean to you?
I don't know. I mean, we all have imposter syndrome. Like,
I don't.
Thank you.
Don't. I'm overqualified, please. Anyway, continue.
I would say probably I would say the kind of turning point in my career was when I got my job at the Washington Post. I think it was like 26 or something, and it was my first it felt like my first like adult person job, and it was the first time that like my starting salary was $70,000, which is a shit ton of money, and so the first time in my life that I wasn't like worried and scrounging, and that I could like start to plan. For all the talk about budgeting and saving and everything, like it's really difficult to do that stuff when you don't have enough money to save in the first place. And so that for me was the first time that I felt like financially like I was coming into like adulthood, but also just career-wise, that was a turning point where I was like, okay, like I'm like have like an adult person's career. So that was I would say that was that.
Love that. Well, Tim, it's been fantastic talking to you, and I'm sure our audience is going to be hungry for a lot more talk about freelancing, wage transparency, all that good stuff. So where can they find more of what you do?
Thank you so much for having me. This is amazing. You can subscribe to my newsletter at freelancingwithtim.substack.com. You can follow me on Twitter at Tim Herrera, where I'm always tweeting about money stuff. You can follow my stuff in Smarter Living at the Times, nytimes.com/smarter living. Tons of personal finance coverage there too.
Love it. And guys, thank you for joining us. Don't forget to advocate for yourself and others at your place of employment or your clients. And I will see you next week, next Monday, in fact, for the next episode of the Financial Confessions. See ya.
Bye.